Hello, my name is Isaac Madsen. I'm with the Washington Oilseed Cropping Systems project at Washington State University. I'm the extension agronomist for that project, and today I'm here at the Wilke farm near Davenport, Washington to talk about some of our winter canola research. Before I get started talking about that research, I want to talk about the broader WOX project and what we work on in that project. So this project specifically looks at developing oilseed crops for Washington, for both food and for biofuels. And mostly in the last few years, we've been working on canola. It's been the most successful crop so far, but we also have worked on flax and sunflowers and safflower and some other experimental crops. In that research program, we have some variety testing at the large scale, and we also have some specific research on sort of the agronomy of canola, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So here at at Wilke farm near Davenport, Washington, we have a few, well actually 4 trials on winter canola, and 2 of those trials I'm going to cover in our in this video today. So what the first trial I'm going to talk about is a winter survival trial, and the second trial is a pea canola intercropping trial, also known as Piola. For the winter survival trial, this project really stemmed out of the need for better winter survival for early seeded canola. So when we seed winter canola, we can seed it late and sort of risk having poor moisture in the soil, and that can end up with just bad stands, or we can seed it early and get good stands. But if we seed it early and get those good stands, frequently we end up with poor winter survival. And the reason for that poor winter survival in the early seeded stands is that winter survival in canola is somewhat determined by the crown height, so how tall the crown is above the soil surface going into the winter and then during the winter. And so what we're trying to do in this study is actually develop sort of techniques that might allow early seeded winter canola to survive the winter better. And so looking at different techniques to help it get established well, and then also how it might survive. And so I'll walk through some of our treatments on that. So our early seeded date was July 10th. So quite early seeding of winter canola. We had really good stand establishment, but as you'll see when I show you some of the individual plots, we actually had some pretty high rates of winter kill in those trials. And so we'll talk about why that was a bit. So the different treatments that we're experimenting with to see if they can improve the winter survival are using plant growth regulators. So in this particular trial, using shortstop and tebuconazole. This is strictly for research purposes at this point in time. But the idea with that is that if we put it onto the young winter canola seedling in the fall, we can keep it from elongating and keep that growing point down near the surface. And by keeping that growing point down near the surface, we can increase winter survival. We're also looking at different techniques such as mowing. So we have a mowing treatment in here. And then we also looked at interseeding the canola with spring oats. And the goal behind that was more on the establishment and forage end for people that are looking at using canola as a dual purpose, or people that are looking for a more uniform establishment of their winter canola. Just to summarize some of our results from that, by and large, the mowing treatments had very, very poor winter survival and don't look so good at this point in time. Generally, the earlier seeding also had some poor winter survival issues just overall. So we had some late seeded or mid seeding, I guess, August checks in there. And those tend to look a little bit better than our July seedings. The oats in the trials also tended to increase crown height a bit and maybe add to some of the moisture stress. Overall, we had higher plant densities in this project, and so we had a bit higher crown heights on most of our treatments. So at this point in time from the Davenport trial, we actually are not exactly sure what our differences are going to be, but it does look like There was an effect from planting date for sure as far as crown height goes, and that translates to a little bit better winter survival in the later treatments. And then with our plant growth regulators, actually at this location, we did not achieve a decrease in crown height, which is a bit of a bummer, not what we were looking for. But we do have two other locations. So we have a location at La Crosse and then a location at Ritzville. And at La Crosse, actually the plant growth regulators, we were able to significantly reduce crown height using the plant growth regulators. So it does seem that these plant growth regulators might have some role in the future for helping us actually reduce the crown height, and that crown height is fairly well linked to winter survival. We're trying to improve the data set that links crown height to winter survival, and we've done this by measuring in our experiments and then just at grower fields all over the region, taking individual plants and measuring their crown height, their crown width, their leaf count, and their canopy size, and then taking that, we're going to try and connect that to the individual survival of these plants. And so that individual survival of these plants is going to really give us a good idea of exactly how important crown height is. And I can tell you from this first year of data, you have very, very high survival when your crown height is set at 0, and then it declines rather rapidly as soon as that crown height starts to get above the surface of the soil. So that's the first trial that I sort of wanted to cover on winter survival and what we're looking at there. We're going to be continuing this into next year with a trial that's going to combine planting date, plant density, and plant growth regulators will be the three treatments in that trial. So one of the things that we sort of noticed anecdotally between our different locations this year, between La Crosse, Davenport, and Ritzville, is that we had different stand densities at each of those locations, and the lower stand densities, as you might expect, had lower crowns, and so they had better winter survival. So what we're going to do this year is we're going to rerun the trial, except for at this point, we're going to make sure that the stand densities at all of these locations are uniform, and we're going to have 3 different levels of stand density at each of these locations. And then we're also going to we're going to use 3 different planting dates, so early July, late July, and then mid-August. And then on each of those, we're going to put the plant growth regulator on. And so hopefully in the future years, this will basically allow us to understand what circumstances we might expect these plant growth regulators to work in, and what the interaction is between planting date, plant density, and plant growth regulators. And so hopefully we can develop some robust management practices to improve winter survival here in Washington with our winter canola. The second trial I want to talk about is this one actually right behind me. It's a pea canola intercropping trial called Piola for short. This is our second year running in this trial, so we do have 1 year of data collected from it. And this is where we plant peas and canola together, and then we have check plots of just peas and just canola. And we're looking at this for different nitrogen rates. So we have 3 different nitrogen rates on our Piola intercrop. We have a nitrogen rate of 0, 30, and 60 pounds of N stream jetted in the spring. And then we also have a plus and minus phosphorus in the fall treatment on top of that. And then we have our check plots that are just peas or just canola. And the check plots of canola have the full rate of nitrogen, and the check plot of peas have the full rate of phosphorus but no nitrogen, as you would expect for a legume. So we're really interested in this as far as growing canola with a reduced nitrogen input. Hopefully we can get some nitrogen from those peas over into the canola, and we're just experimenting with that. When you compare intercroppings, you use this number called the land equivalence ratio, and that's calculated by looking at the relative yields of peas and canola in the intercrops to the monocultures. And so we're going to be assessing this for the 2021 harvest year, but we already have data from the 2020 harvest year. And in 2020, we got an LER, which is the land equivalence ratio, of 1.46. So you can sort of look at that as an overall productivity of 146%. So much more productive system than the monocultures. Obviously, there's some sort of added technical issues and logistic difficulties with that, as far as restricting the herbicides you can use and the need for cleaning the seed and separating the peas from canola. But hopefully we're looking at this and there'll be enough benefits from the intercropping that we won't have to, it'll outweigh essentially the negatives. Another interesting thing that we found on these intercrops is that when you actually look at the insects involved in these systems, so the piola, the intercropping, actually has more of the beneficial insects and less of the sort of negative insects. So we found a lot more predatory insects in the piola in some trials we did last year. So we found more ladybugs and parasitic wasps, and so that's sort of an exciting aspect of this, is that it looks like by intercropping you actually might be able to reduce some of your insect pests in these systems also. And so that's all the research I want to summarize for today. There's a lot more information on winter canola on our website. So the Washington Oilseeds website, which is css.wsu.edu/oilseeds, or you can just type in WSU Oilseeds and you'll find it. We also have a Facebook page, Washington Oilseeds, if you want to follow that. We update some photo albums on there so that you can see just what's going on as far as what we're scouting for in the field, what insects we're seeing, what weeds we're seeing, you know, what the crop is looking like overall. If you want to follow us on that, that's great. And with that, I'll close it out. So thank you very much. Okay, so if we look right down here, we can see one of the aspects of winter piola we really like here, which is that the canola sort of forms a trellis that the peas then grow up. So you can see that the tendrils of the peas are actually wrapping around the winter canola. And what we experienced last year is that actually at the end of the growing season, when the canola is all potted out, the peas will climb all the way out the top of the canola and will actually be flowering and setting pods up there. So that's one of the aspects we really like. And as well as that above ground architecture that's super complementary, there's also a sort of complementary underground architecture where peas have a shallower root system and the canola has a much deeper root system. And so we think we'll be able to get a more efficient utilization of our water using the piola intercropping over just the straight peas or canola. Okay, so here's a great example of how the early seeded canola, some of it didn't work out so well. So here's a canola plant that was super elongated, got up super tall, and actually ended up basically here just dying out over the winter. And so this is in a plot that had oats interseeded with the early seeded canola. A lot of these plants looked pretty drought stressed, even in the fall, and many of them did not make it through the winter. So that's one thing to consider if you are thinking about these companion cropping systems with the oats in them, is that could be a problem. This one actually also had a PGR on it, and you can see that PGR didn't do much to limit this plant growth or save that particular plant. So here we are in this same oat and canola early seeding experiment, and I just want to show you some of the things that can happen to canola after some winter damage. So here's one of our plant stakes. So we put out 500 of these last fall, individual plants, and this is where we measured the crown height and the crown width on each of these plants. And then we came back and looked at it here in the spring to see if they'd survived. Now what I'm going to show you here is, just move the stake out of the way for a second, the sort of apical meristem on this plant actually had all died, and then what we ended up seeing is some axial growth after that death. And you can see that really this plant is way behind any of the other plants that just sort of matured normally, and so it's probably going to make essentially nothing for yield. I have seen plants sort of do that axial adaptation and be all right, but in this instance it's looking pretty rough. And so just something to be aware of is that canola is pretty adaptive, right? So it can lose some of that growth potential and then recover to some degree, but you're never going to get the same yield or plant out of it if you get that side growth growing as if you'd had that initial apex still growing. Here we are in the once again in the oat and canola plots. and you can see here's some of that residue from the oats actually still left over. And so that was spring oats that we were using as a sort of nurse crop, and in this particular instance it didn't work out very well. What we're looking at here is actually one of our plants. So this is plant 387 from last fall, and we went out and actually measured each of these individual plants that got a stake, and we measured their crown height and their crown width and their canopy and the total number of leaves, and then we came back to see if it survived in the spring. And what you can see is this one initially actually would have got a survival rating of 0 because the crown died here and this growth hadn't kicked on. But what we see after the crown died is that you do actually get some axial growth occurring later on in the growing season. But really that plant isn't going to catch up and isn't going to make a good yield in this particular instance. So wild canola can be really adaptive in growing around some of these problems. There's a limit to what it can handle.